Mackenzie is still with Jim Wallace. We might want to make a final point before we cut him off in his prime.
Indeed, still waiting. That, of course, was the national turnout that we got there. Jim, I was just going to say that our poll this morning, NOP poll, seemed to show that Labour could very well have majority in this Parliament. You could say they're riding high at the moment, but there's no guarantee that you're actually going to be able to form any part of a coalition administration, is there?
Put it this way, if Labour Party has a majority of votes in Scotland when the election comes, then it's only fair that it would get a majority of seats. I don't believe the Labour Party will get a majority of votes when that election comes. It'll be midway through a period of Labour government. And in fact, I mean, they're still enjoying a honeymoon. As the opinion polls showed at the general election, they didn't actually, when it came to the bit, I mean, they'd been polling in Scotland 52, 53, sometimes 56% before the last general election. When it came to polling day, even on a landslide day, they got something like 45, 46%. We're 2 years away from it. We can batter around with figures. What I was going on to say was, I think we're going to have to work out how we best fight an election which is going to be a different one, so many first past the post seats, and also the top-up. If I can give you an example, in Glasgow, where probably for the last 3 elections, Labour has swept the board every first past the post seat, there is no way that Labour is going to get any top-up in Glasgow. And therefore people, when they put their second ballot, when they're voting for a party, they might well think that, you know, they could vote for a party other than the Labour Party. We might get a lot of cross-voting, and that's one of our campaign targets, no doubt, is to try and persuade people who maybe put their first ballot to elect a particular Labour candidate, actually might be able to vote Liberal Democrat with their second ballot. I think, you know, there's going to be a number of strategies we're going to have to work out as we approach this election. But I think the fact it's going to be proportional representation, I think, will actually lead to a new kind of politics in the Scottish Parliament. Politicians are going to be obliged to cooperate with each other, and that can only be good for Scottish democracy.
OK, Jim, thank you very much. Kirsty, back to you. We, of course, got a bit overexcited there. There is still one result to come. We believe it's Highland before that final historic moment when a Scottish Parliament is finally announced from the podium.
Thank you very much, Anne. At 4:30, Dawn's about to break, so I think we should bring you up to date with where we are now, with one result still to come. Look at the share of the vote after 31 councils. 74% of the electorate votes for a Scottish Parliament, 26% votes not to have a Scottish Parliament. Tax-paying powers, 64% of the electorate plays 36% of the electorate on the question of tax-paying powers. Now look at the list there of yes, no, still sitting at 2. Orkney Islands, yes to the first question, no to the second, as is Dumfries and Galloway. Everybody else voted yes. Let's see what Donald Dewar, the Scottish Secretary, said. We go forward with moral authority. I don't believe anyone can obstruct the passage of the bill now. Jim Wallace, leader of Liberal Democrats, you just heard him there. This is what my party has been fighting for 100 years. And Alex Salmond, we've embarked on a journey, and the end of this journey will be independence. Point of contention with Labour Party there. And John Redwood, Shadow Trade and Industry, Scotland will have more politicians, more bureaucrats, more meddling, and he also went on to say, and a lesser health service. Raymond Robertson, on the other hand, of the Scottish Conservatives, said, if a parliament is created, yes, we will put up candidates. And I know, in fact, that these lists of candidates are circulating already. So the summary, it has now happened. We must therefore live with it. That's what Grant Beard said of Scottish Financial Enterprise. And that signals that, in fact, business has indeed accepted that there will be a Scottish Parliament and it will have tax-paying powers. Now, the BBC and NOP together conducted a poll of attitudes among the electorate before they went out to vote today. And Peter Snow has some further details. Peter.
Okay, so let's look a bit harder what Alex Salmond was saying there about the Scottish Parliament leading to independence and the Labour Party believing that the Scottish Parliament will not lead to independence but secure the future of the United Kingdom. Our poll has some interesting reflections on that. First of all, we asked people what they thought was the best future for Scotland. No huge surprises here, but nevertheless, one or two interesting thoughts. 54% for devolution looks good for the Labour Party. That, after all, is Labour's and the SNP's short-term project for the future, and the Liberal Democrats as well. Independence, the Labour Party might say 20%, a very low figure. People thinking of the future as an independent one, on the whole, they don't want to see independence, they say. 20% only, a fifth. That's rather low. It's normally rather higher than that, a quarter or even a third sometimes. No change, 25%. That's the Tory party policy, 25% there. But just look at that now in the light of this. We also asked people what they thought would be the effect of a Scottish Parliament. Not what they wanted, but what they thought the effect would be. Would it lead to independence? Would it not lead to independence? Would it lead to the breakup of the UK? Would it not lead to the breakup of the UK? And look what they thought. They thought 61% of them, nearly two-thirds, thought that the Scottish Parliament would lead to independence. An awful lot of people there are Labour Party voters. Kirsty, back to you quickly.
Yes, because I think we're just about to hear the declaration from the Highlands, the last one to declare. No, we're not. And now we can actually see Donald Dewar leaving in his car, leaving the count there. Not perhaps waiting for the Highlands. He's had a long night, very happy. Thumbs up, and I'm sure it couldn't possibly be his car horn tooting. But as he leaves the Edinburgh International Conference Centre, heading back, I imagine, to Glasgow, or perhaps even to Bute House in Charlotte Square, his official residence. So that's Donald Dewar leaving the count. And we can pick up, I hope, on what Peter Snow was saying there with John Swinney. Leading to independence, leading to the breakup of the United Kingdom, very strong feeling among the people that we spoke to in our telephone poll that this might happen.
Well, there's an element of contradiction in the evidence that you've posed, but I think there is a recognition in the polls that you've conducted that there is a process that we've started, and the key thing about the process is that it's up to the people of Scotland to determine how far down that process they wish to travel. And I hope the people of Scotland warmly welcome the establishment of a devolved Parliament that performs a role in building the confidence and the assertiveness of the people of Scotland, and that it ultimately leads to independence, but it must be driven by the wishes and the desires of the Scottish people. And we've seen tonight a fantastic expression of the opinions of the people of Scotland in wishing to take more control and more responsibility for their own affairs.
You know, we mustn't lose sight that it is a historic moment for Scotland. Did you ever think, I mean, did any of your private polling indicate that the levels of support would be so high?
Well, in the work that I carried out in my own constituency, amongst people who were not terribly sympathetic to the SNP at the general election, I came away with the view that we'd probably deliver a result which was 70-30 on the first question, 60-40 on the second question. That's been somewhat exceeded by the polls tonight, and I'm delighted that's been the case. It is rather hard to imagine on this night that we have actually voted today to establish a Scottish Parliament, and that's a very inspiring moment, and I think a moment which many people throughout Scotland should take great pride that it's been delivered tonight.
John Mackay, presumably you must accord with that. There's a pride in the vote tonight?
Well, I think I mentioned earlier on that I have no trouble with my pride in Scotland. I'm disappointed in the vote tonight because I think there are some worrying things that could come out of it, but I think it's could is the appropriate word. And I think if people who don't believe, as John Swinney does in the breakup of the United Kingdom, act sensibly within the Parliament and within the United Kingdom Parliament, then we can make it work for Scotland and for Britain. Well,
let's look at that again. We can actually look at Peter Snow's findings of the NOP BBC poll there to show what the figures were for both the Scottish Parliament leading to independence. 61% of our respondents said it would lead to independence against 31%. Will lead to the breakup of the United Kingdom. 40% said it would against 50%. Brian Wilson, do you have any residual worries that in the years to come there will be a breakup of the United Kingdom?
No, I don't. I mean, I've always accepted that if people want it, they'll vote for it and they can have it. And I just keep repeating this, that it is not a constitutional mechanism which has prevented the SNP from obtaining their goal. It's the fact that people haven't voted for it. And we saw in the rather more important figures from Peter were people's preferences, and what it showed was independence at 20%. Now, you know, you don't get the creation of a separate state on the basis of 20%.
On the basis of 20%, John Smith.
But if people do want it at some future time, then so be it.
The entire Scottish media in the last 6 months has been focused on, the entire debate has been focused on a scheme of devolution. It's not surprising you get a snapshot figure like that the day that we're actually voting in a devolution referendum. If you look at the long-term trend, there's been a clear pattern of about 1 in 3 people in Scotland wishing independence to be delivered.
Do you think tonight, Charles Kenny, is an underestimation of desire for independence tonight, or do you think that what people are voting for, very, very frankly, tonight is a Scottish Parliament and no more?
I think it's that much and no more at this stage. I think the great unknown in Scottish politics, and in truth I don't think any of the four of us can really predict it, is what happens to what I'd call the capital N political nationalist vote. I mean, I think a lot of people, including a lot of Scottish Conservatives, very nationalistic politically, but perhaps not in the political sense of John's party. Now, it's what happens to a lot of those SNP voters who might say, this is what we've always wanted to see established, And you might find as Europe develops, of course, and as the UK develops, I suspect, in a more federal way, that in fact this will satisfy the aspirations. But in truth, none of us know at this stage.
No, but a number of leading Conservatives have said, John Mackay, that the intellectually coherent position, of course including Michael Forsyth, the intellectually coherent position is independence. It's the status quo or independence.
No, I don't agree with that, actually. There's certainly another equally coherent one, which is federalism, which you could operate, and that would get round some of the problems. But I actually think, if I may use a hackneyed phrase, where there's a will, there's a way. And as quite clearly from these results, I believe I can see that majority of my fellow Scots want a parliament in Scotland. But I also believe that the great majority of my fellow Scots want to remain part of the United Kingdom.
Well, let's put that across to Peter Kellner, who makes a living out of looking and manoeuvring around these figures.
Kirsty, in looking at over 20 years of polling on independence, devolution and status quo, I've never seen a figure for independence as low as the one we've got tonight. 20% instead of the 30-35% that John Swinney said rightly has been the norm. And support for devolution, I've never seen it as high as it is at 54%. It seems to me there's a real strategic problem for the nationalists. If this Scottish Parliament succeeds, if it's reckoned doing a good job, then you're not going to get the dissatisfaction that I think the nationalists need to get that support for independence back up. So are the Scottish nationalists going to work for the Parliament to succeed and therefore quell the demand for independence, or are they going to work for failure in order to excite that disappointment they need?
I think John Swinney, is there any chance of you working for the failure of the Parliament in order to further independence?
I think it's a fascinating argument that Peter advances, but it rather misses the point that if people in Scotland see a Parliament succeeding, they may wish to have further aspirations about the powers and the responsibilities that that Parliament may wish to assume. So the Parliament, the development of the Parliament in a creative and positive sense actually fuels the process of independence, rather than the process of independence having to be created simply by division.
Might the converse be true then, Peter Kellner?
Well, it's possible, but the history of the Scottish nationalists is that they've risen and fallen in waves of the last 30 years according to dissatisfaction with the prevailing ruling system.
Robin Oakley wants to put his halfpence in.
Well, we're certainly going to see a different relationship, aren't we, from tomorrow between the Labour Party and the Scottish National Party. When you were asking earlier about how long the honeymoon might now continue, and George Robertson was with us, his body language told us a lot. He didn't reach for a calendar or a diary. He pushed back his cuff and looked at his watch. And that's the kind of time interval we're talking about in terms of continued cooperation, is it not?
Yeah,
because in whose interest would it be, John Swinney, to keep the cooperation going?
Well, I think the issue which is now at stake is we've got legislation that we have to address on the basis of a very strong mandate from the people of Scotland to deliver a Scottish Parliament. And I think the points that have been made about the need for there to be no obstruction to that process are points that are well made and which the SNP would fully support. It doesn't mean to say we won't scrutinise, but we would obviously put no obstacles in the way of the legislation taking its course. In terms of where cooperation goes, PR changes the whole landscape of Scottish politics, and the Labour Party cannot assume for all time that it is going to dominate this institution. There are going to be many dynamics coming forward, and I reiterate the point that out of the development and the strength of the Parliament may come great optimism.
Let's look at your leader now. Let's look at your leader now, John Swinney. In the spirit of cooperation, the leader of the SNP, Alex Salmond, is leaving the conference centre with the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Jim Wallace. And just taking a chance for the pair of them to stand and have a word.
This is an exceptionally good night for Scotland. I think these results exceed expectation. I mean, we said, look, Scotland had an opportunity and it should have the self-confidence to grasp it. That's precisely what we've done. And, you know, the Scottish Parliament couldn't get off on any surer footing than what we've got tonight.
Did it exceed your expectations, Mr. Salmond?
Oh, I think it exceeded everybody's expectations. I mean, Jim and I were conscious in the last couple of days of the campaign that the argument was flowing towards us. I mean, we were winning the debates hand down on the television, and the feeling and the reception in the streets was very good. But I don't think anyone expected to get the overwhelming vote on both questions. And the really good thing about tonight is every single area of Scotland has voted yes to the principle of a Scottish Parliament. We're all moving forward, and we're moving forward together.
So what message does this now send to Westminster?
Well, I think we better sit up and take notice that something is changing in Scotland. And, you know, there's going to be folk waking up tomorrow morning, and they're going to look at these results, and they're going to realise and be glad that something's been born in Scotland tonight. Our first Parliament for 300 years, and we've done it with a bang. not a whimper.
Is this a lesson for the future in Scotland? When Scotland's parties get together, this is the kind of result you can provide?
Well, I think the Scottish Parliament, by the very fact that it's going to be elected by a system of proportional representation, I mean, those who are elected to Parliament are going to be obliged to find a much more cooperative spirit than anything we see at Westminster. And that's a lesson that Westminster is going to have to come to terms with too, because I think the public will recognise what actually can be done when parties establish that there's common ground and can build on it. Now, it doesn't mean to say the party battle is going to disappear. There's still going to be differences, and it's important these differences are put before the electorate at elections and at different programmes. But when people get into the Parliament, I mean, if anything's going to be done, there is going to have to be cross-party cooperation. And I think what we will see there, and an opportunity for people to participate in decision-making, it's going to be a whole new style of politics. And I think, what's the message for Westminster? The message for Westminster is not just that Scotland is awake, it's that I think this is the first step in a democratisation of Britain, a modernisation of our whole constitution.
What advice do you have now for the cowed and defeated unionists?
Well, the issue, I mean, in some respects, we might have freed the Scottish Tory party tonight.
Don't overplay this.
Not overplay it. No, but I mean, there is a Conservative vote in Scotland. It will be fairly represented in the Scottish Parliament. And, I hope that all people who serve in the Parliament will be trying to come forward with policies which will be to promote the good of Scotland.
The Tories have got themselves into a daft position. I mean, they've been spending the last 4 weeks saying that independence was inevitable if this vote went ahead. And now they've got themselves in a position of saying they're going to stand for the Parliament to stop something they've already considered to be inevitable. Now, I mean, I've never argued independence was inevitable. What I've said is let's trust the people. And that Scotland will become independent when the people vote for it. And what's exciting about this development is we'll all be able to present our policies to the people. Jim for federalism, myself for independence, Donald Dewar for devolution, and even the Tories, although they'll have to work out whether they want to go back to the status quo or not. But everybody now will be able to present their policies in a Scottish context and let the people judge. What we showed in the Yes campaign is that we trusted the people of Scotland. What the people have showed is that they trusted us.
With this kind of majority, is it the case that this Parliament will now never go away?
Oh, I think a Scottish Parliament is here to stay. All that remains to be determined is what kind of Parliament.
How are you going to celebrate tonight, gentlemen?
Well, we're just going to a party now, aren't we?
I'm buying the drink.
Yeah. And then you guys are sort of all wanting us to appear in breakfast programmes before too long, so there'll not be much sleep.
We hope. All right.
We'll national drink, perhaps?
In moderation.
Come on in, Jim. Come on.
And that's Alex Salmond ushering Jim Wallace away. Brian Wilson, when you hear language like a new politics is born in Scotland, a new style of politics, and then when you look ahead to the possibility that the Scottish Parliament might have a universal nursery education for the under-5s when it doesn't exist in England, that Scotland might still have a grant system for university when it doesn't exist in England, how do you think that will play with English constituencies?
No, I don't think that's the question at all. I mean, you see, they always talk about consensus. And consensus is very easy and very desirable where there are shared aims. But politics is about a social agenda. It's about an economic agenda. It's who holds power and who is exploited by power. And these are issues in which you cannot build, glib consensus like the kind of thing we've just been hearing. But there are divisions in society, and the purpose of politics is to reflect divisions.
Brian Wilson, if I can just say so, you're bringing this honeymoon to an end.
If it is all platitudes, then it is just ridiculous. And it is platitudes if people say that they're going to agree on things on which they disagree. And the great majority of people in Scotland, as reflected in your poll, do not want a separate Scotland. Now, that is not a matter in which you can have consensus. You either agree with a proposition or you disagree with it. And so there has been the potential for cooperation on this issue because the nationalists. Now, let's get this right. The nationalists, this enthusiasm for the scheme. I mean, what a pity then that Alex Salmond hadn't said it 3 months or 3 years ago, instead of talking about puppet parliaments, instead of boycotting the Scottish Constitutional Convention. So it's fine, there's been a potential for consensus for a few weeks, but it doesn't mean that all politics, it doesn't mean that all politics are suspended.
It's quite surprising that the Scottish electorate hasn't been a bit more cynical about the getting together of Labour and the SNP over this.
The Scottish electorate know what they want. There is a settled will of the Scottish people, and they can measure and they can judge words. But they were not going to be diverted from what they wanted. And as I said right at the start of this, I think what they wanted was established not in the last 4 weeks, but in the night that the Tories pushed the poll tax in Scotland through the House of Commons. And people said that must never be allowed to happen again.
Do you believe, put your hand on your heart, do you believe that the nationalists working in a Scottish Parliament will not pursue the same social agenda and the same economic agenda as you? Because surely that's where you're saying the importance of a Scottish Parliament lies, not in pushing some agenda for independence. Do you believe that, what will it be in the balance? What will they do?
I think on the record of it, Kirsty, the nationalists will calculate where they think they can get advantage. In the same way as they calculated, they thought they could get advantage by staying out of the Constitutional Convention, and 6 weeks ago they thought they could get advantage by
John
coming
Swinney,
in on the
SNP
back
just
of what was being done.
opportunist.
Well, you know, it's late at night, and I'm not going to try to dissuade Brian of his long-held prejudice about the SNP, but you know, what's important is that the people of Scotland were offered honest proposals from the political parties on May the 1st, and we put our independence proposals very honestly to the people of Scotland. We recognise the people of Scotland did not support us on May the 1st, and we have respected and reflected the pace at which the people of Scotland want to move. Now, for Brian to say that our social and economic agenda is out of step with opinions within Scotland, I think our agenda is much closer to aspirations within Scotland than some of the proposals that are taken forward by his government.
Why don't people vote for you?
Charles Kennedy, when you hear John Swinney and Brian Wilson speaking on this night in these terms, what do you think?
Oh, we'll be back to business as usual in politics, and so we should. We're living in a democracy. There's and so we should. There's nothing wrong with that. I think there will be a problem for the SNP myself, because tonight a fuse has been lit. There's a great deal of excitement and all the rest of it. Then you're going to have the elections. You're going to have all the setting up of the Parliament. You're going to have great coverage of the legislation going through. And I think you see that the nationalists are in a bit of a cleft stick for the next several years up to, and I think beyond the next Westminster election, which is that if they're seen to behave in a less than constructive way, in a truculent way, in an obstructive way, and I'm not saying that John's proposing that they do, but if they are perceived to do that to keep their own profile up, I think they'll suffer. If, on the other hand, they do play their constructive part and it's seen to go well, I think, as Peter Kellner was saying a little bit earlier, it slightly reduces the potential for them to increase their share of the vote.
John Mackay.
Well, if I can speak from a slightly neutral position in this little family argument that's going on in front of me, parties come together on major issues. They did so before. I can remember campaigning with Labour and Liberal Democrat people for entry into Europe and the referendum we had then. But frankly, when that referendum was over, we continued to stand by our quite different principles. And that will happen this time. And the idea that PR somehow removes that is nonsense. Look at Ireland, look at Israel, look at Italy. They have PR. Their parliaments are robust, and the arguments between them are very robust.
But I mean, Alex Salmond, that you wouldn't even get a seat in the Scottish Parliament under PR. That's quite a damning thing for him to say.
What did he say?
He said that the Conservatives wouldn't even get a seat under PR in the Scottish Parliament.
Perhaps I should tell Alex that we actually won a local government by-election last night, and frankly, 25% of people are still opposed to it on that poll. I'd be happy. I'd have had that vote on the 1st of May, I can tell you, and 36% don't want tax-raising powers in it. I'd be delighted to go for that vote. So I think the Conservative Party will have a substantial showing in this Parliament, because in some ways this issue of a Scottish Parliament has now been decided this evening. A line has been drawn, and we will now go forward inside that Parliament, inside the United Kingdom.
And going forward inside that Parliament, if indeed the electorate does vote for you as a minority, would you be prepared to do deals in particular? Well, whatever. Let's say you're in a position to do deals with other parties. Is there anyone you won't do a deal with in this new Scotland?
Oh, I'm not going to say who we would or wouldn't do a deal with if it comes to PR and you need to do deals. Some amazing deals are done, which is one of the reasons I'm not terribly in favour of PR. It tends to be the tail wags the dog, and I certainly am in favour of that. But one would have to wait and see. You would have to make sure you had a credible government of your country. And the last thing I would want to see is my country having a total shambles. And if that means cooperation, even with Brian Wilson, I might cooperate. Right, he might not want to cooperate with me, mind you, but...
At this point, let's just hear a little more from Peter Snow on why people voted the way they did.
Just a little bit more from our poll of... not voters, but people in Scotland while the voting was taking place and before it. On the telephone, we talked about 2,000 people. And we've got quite a few more interesting little indicators here. For example, that the Labour Party stayed very solid. These are the people who voted yes. 93% of Labour supporters voted yes. So the thought that Labour was divided about this, that some would be voting no, that Sam Dalziel was carrying quite a legion with him, not really right. 93%, in fact, exactly the same proportions of the Labour Party and the SNP stuck together behind the yes vote. Whereas the Liberal Democrats were a bit softer, 25% of them appear to have not voted yes. But not intending to vote yes, of course. This is not an exit poll. This is people saying what they would do. Here we have the opinion poll again on the age gap, and you can see here quite clearly that there has been more incentive of the younger people to go for the yes than the people rather older, very much as expected, and the polls have been showing this through the campaigns. But a very solid vote by the young people for yes, and a rather less solid vote by the elderly.
Peter, thank you very much. Now, Robin Oakley, if I can just turn to you, because as Brian said, the bill is in preparation at the moment. But when do you think we can see a bill presented to Parliament, on a Scottish Parliament?
Well, we've got to go through the party conferences first. Parliament gets back at the end of October after the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which will be in Edinburgh. Everything's happening in Scotland now. And as soon as the House of Commons gets back, the government are going to want to get on with the legislation fast if they're going to get the bill through, as is their target, by July of next year. So I think we would see the Scotland bill introduced quite early in November.
But they've promised detailed examination.
Oh yes, there will still be detailed examination, but with the kind of moral authority that they've got, they're going to be very tempted to have some of this bill's detailed examination performed in committee rather than done on the floor of the House. And there's certainly going to be a fair amount of ructions about the relative time devoted to those two ways of looking at the legislation.
Politicians nodding their heads there, but Brian Taylor, can you look ahead and see any hitches along the way?
No, I can't, frankly, and I think the point that Robin makes there is a serious one. We heard Donald Dewar saying earlier that he wouldn't brook what he called obstruction, in other words, obstructive tactics in both the Commons and the Lords. Obviously an indication to the upper house that he wouldn't put up with any nonsense from them, given the mandate tonight, but I think also an indication that the thing that Robin was mentioning, perhaps taking the bill through its detailed proposals in committee rather than on the floor of the full House. In other words, not clogging up the Commons. There's a pretty good reason for that, which is that you don't want to rub the noses of the English MPs too much in endless Scottish legislation while they're perhaps wanting to get on with other business. So my guess would certainly be that as a consequence of the nature of the mandate tonight, it would be there would be an attempt made to accelerate the bill through the Commons to the obvious chagrin of the Conservatives, but I think that's what will happen.
Well, let's now take a look at the conference hall. People, they're waiting for the final vote from Highland, which we're expecting in 10 minutes' time. Now, normally, the Highlands vote doesn't come into the next day, but there has been voting in different areas. And Charlie Kennedy's here. Tell me, Charlie Kennedy, why is a delay in the Highlands? I mean, this is very much your area. I'm not blaming you for this delay, but it is taking quite a long time.
I don't really know why there's such a delay, because in fact, if you take the three parliamentary constituencies, well, unfortunately, one of the three is now represented, Brian, by a Labour MP. Maybe that's what the fly in the ointment is compared with days gone by. But each of those three parliamentary seats that make up the Highland Council area, whose result we're waiting for, now declare overnight. And with the exception of mishaps at the election before last, 1992, the Inverness East seat was delayed till about this time because one of the helicopters unfortunately went down and the ballot box was lost. But unless something like that's happened, I cannot really understand why there should be this delay. What they did in Inverness this time, unlike the general election in May, is they chose not to count the three parliamentary seats, as it were, in the normal counting places, which would be Wick, Dingwall and Inverness. They
Maybe
took
the
all the boxes.
Have gone to the wrong place.
Maybe the helicopters have gone to the wrong place, indeed. I just hope that
We have to
the
remember,
Highlands are not going to end
area,
them.
this is the size of Belgium, this area. It's a fifth of the land mass of Scotland.
It is, but
Massive area.
in terms of the general spread, I mean, if you look at what they've done in Argyll and Bute, where they've rather sensibly counted in a variety of different locations, transferred all the votes into a central location and then agreed that with Edinburgh, I think it would have been better all round if we'd done that in the Highlands.
Just sticking with areas of contention during the campaign and looking to what Grant Baird said from Scottish Financial Enterprise, we will learn to work with this Parliament. Business has yet to be fully convinced, hasn't it, on the second question, no matter what the electorate says?
Yes, that's right, and I think that...
Is that a failure in the campaign, do you think?
No, not necessarily, because I don't think business was ever going to be persuaded in advance of tonight's vote. I think really what all of us now, all four parties, have got to do is not imagine, even with the scale of the victory that we've seen here tonight, that the persuasion task stops. I think the persuasion task goes on, and I think that the real test of success will be by the time we get to those elections, if the arguments are long since gone about the anxieties over tax, business, commerce, and whether in fact it's simply a matter as to which set of policies offer the best menu for the business community in Scotland.
Well, I mean, John Swinney is an economist. What do you think it will actually take to convince business?
I think it's performance that actually is what matters, and the regime within which businesses got to operate. Now, there was anxiety during the campaign that corporation tax, for example, would be varied by the Scottish Parliament. Now, that's an issue that can be quite easily clarified by the bill that goes through Parliament, and when the Parliament actually goes about its business, it can begin to develop a record which will hopefully persuade business that government of Scotland, by Scotland, in Scotland, is to the advantage of the business community.
But the relative thing, Kirsty, is how little, it's not how much opposition there was from the business community, but how little. And some of them went through the motions. But there wasn't a huge campaign.
There was actually a debate within the business community.
And many of those who had been opposed before, that they were neutralised.
So business will wait and see. Yeah. Well, at this point in the proceedings, we've had a virtual parliament from Peter Snow. We've even had a cable car up Ben Nevis, which is certainly a first in Scotland. But we haven't seen much of the swingometer. Now, Peter Snow does have his swingometer with him.
Well, no, this is a first. This is a first in this parliament, because we're going to show you now in just a moment what the swingometer looks like in the light of the election of May 1997. Let me first of all remind you where we were in the May election. The Labour Party had 44% of the vote. The Tory Party had 31%. So it was a 13% gap between them. And there was 17% for the Liberal Democrats in that election. Look what's happened in the polls average over the months since then. The fact is the Labour Party has soared ahead even further than that. That 13% gap has now opened right up to an even larger gap between the two main parties, and the Liberal Democrats have shrunk back a bit. So it really is an enormous gap between Labour and the Conservatives. Devastating situation for the Conservatives there. They're 34% behind Labour, and the Liberal Democrats are down there to 11% in the latest average of the polls. Let me just bring on now our old friend the swingometer and show you where we are. Here are the vulnerable Labour MPs to a swing to the Conservatives along here, and here are the vulnerable Tory MPs if there's a swing at the next general election. I know it's a long way away. That's all right, that's right too. But I thought you just might like to see it. And here is the swing to Labour, and these are the vulnerable Tory MPs that would go down. Now, if there's no swing at all at the next general election, again, yes, all right, a long way away, 179 is the majority Labour have. If there's no swing at all, then, of course, Labour would stay there with that huge majority. The fact is that the Tories, if they're to win the next election, need a bigger swing than any party has achieved since 1945. Look, it's going way up there. You still have a Labour majority with a 7% swing. It needs an 11.5% swing for enough of these red figures here to turn blue for the Tories to win an overall majority. Now, what's happened since the general election? One, the Uxbridge by-election. Now, there was a swing to the Conservatives at the Uxbridge by-election of 5%. A few of these, if it happened in a general election, a few of these Labour MPs would have turned from red to blue, and there would have been a swing to the Tories. But the Labour Party would still have had, if that had happened in general election, a huge majority. The fact is, though, that the polls are now suggesting not a swing to the Conservatives, but a swing to Labour of no less than 11%. 11%. So for the general election now, on that basis, you'd have a Labour majority of 400, and just look what would be left of the Tory party. A handful of MPs over here with a huge, great swathe of red figures over there for Labour.
Maybe we should go to the polls.
I think Peter Snow just wanted us to stay in the air till 5 o'clock to make sure that he could actually get that graphic in. Brian Taylor.
This is becoming faintly surreal. We're sitting in a studio at 5 in the morning.
Waiting for Highland.
Scotland has just voted massively with resolute determination for a parliament with tax-varying powers. And Peter is explaining to us the swing at the next general election. It's wonderful.
Well, let's take something.
I'm enjoying every second of it.
Let's take something that's not quite so surreal.
Yes.
In the white paper, there has been a deal done. There will be a boundary commission, whatever it is, 2004, which means that elections to the second Scottish Parliament may not be on the basis of the Westminster boundaries of 72, 73 seats. But if there's fewer seats at Westminster, what does that do to the amount of MSPs that go to a parliament by first past the post? I'm thinking here that a heck of a lot more are going to be in a top-up from party lists. And what does that do?
They're reduced. They would reduce the numbers. If there are only, let's say, 58 MPs going to Westminster, then there would be 58 first past the post at the Scottish Parliament, and they would reduce the proportion coming from the list system as well. So the Parliament would shrink, the Parliament would squeeze. in consequence. That's something that hasn't the light of large
we haven't actually got this Parliament yet, and we're talking about 129 MSPs, and yet with a boundary commission change, we could be reducing the number of MSPs at a Parliament in the second term of a Parliament.
That's what is specified in the White Paper, it being 5 a.m. and being a wild speculation time. I'll give you 10 to 1 it doesn't happen, and then once 129 MPs are set up in the Scottish Parliament, that no boundary commission on earth would be able to alter that.
Isn't this also linked, though, because the top-up MPs are decided on existing European boundaries? Now, these, of course, won't exist because we're going to fight the next European elections under proportional representation of a different form to the way in which we're going to fight the Scottish Parliament elections. But I would have thought, is there not going to be, Brian, some knock-on effect there as well?
There is. You would have to use notional boundary areas rather than the European...
Maybe Peter could explain
Bring back
no sooner is an architectural competition out for a Parliament to seat 129 MSPs, and there's some concern about whether there will be 129 MSPs.
Make it smaller and
I actually hope the government will give some thought to this problem. I suspect when they started off with the White Paper, the proposition hadn't yet emerged from Cabinet that the European elections would be fought on PR, and therefore the European constituencies would cease to exist. I do think, seriously, that they should try to set it out, start off in a fashion that actually can be sustained for a few years. And there will have to be boundary commissions from time to time, but I think we should, I will certainly be suggesting to the government that as they have time, that they really try to set the thing off on the right foot and not be changing it immediately in the next Parliament.
Well, Donald Dewar talked about not changing the prospectus, but Brian Wilson, on the basis that if Labour is in the majority in a Scottish Parliament, there would not be the use of tax-varying powers in the first term of a Westminster government. How can Tony Blair say that in the year 2000, when the Scottish Parliament is set up, that the health service in Scotland will be better off? Because Tony Blair is committed to, in a sense, reducing spending in line with the Conservative pledges, and spending in the health service would actually reduce.
No, what we are committed to doing is living within the overall expenditure that we've inherited. But we're about, within the Scottish Office, we're in the process of a very major operation of reallocation of expenditure according to our political priorities. And already in my own field in education, we've managed to find £20 million extra for an early intervention programme. I'm going to be announcing on Monday the distribution of £200 million for education. I mean, we're finding a lot of money for the things that matter. And you see, I think that
But it's interesting, because if you're finding this money, and under a Scottish Parliament you say you'll continue to reprioritise, you're finding this money now, where are you taking it from?
Well, we're taking it within the internal, we are reassessing priorities, and we found money through the budget, through the Westminster budget, 300 million coming to Scotland for welfare to work, and a very big injection for education. So we can find the money if the political will is there at Westminster and in the Scottish Parliament.
You know, Brian's point is fair insofar as it goes, that there will be, there can be a reprioritising directed by an elected Scottish Parliament under the proposals that have been supported by the public tonight. But I think when we actually look at the social and economic agenda of people within Scotland, I think people will be looking for the Parliament to be ambitious in some of the initiatives that it takes forward, and I can't see how that can be done within the limited resources that are currently available. And if you look at the problems that local authorities are facing throughout Scotland, we're seeing the difficulties of constrained ambitions within the provision of public services. So there's a circle there that has been trying desperately to be squared by the government, and I think the Scottish Parliament will have to address that as part of its deliberations.
But Peter Lilly said you cannot improve services without spending more money. Now, where is that money going to be spent? Might it be spent at a local level? Might there be an increase in local taxation?
Well, if you look at the government has, in all of its indications so far, for example, have been that the capping regime introduced by John Mackay and his colleagues is going to be maintained and rigorously pursued. Now, if that's the case in local authorities, then there will be some very severe decisions to be taken in the coming financial year. If that's relaxed, different matter altogether.
Well, let's hear from the North East now, and Jane Frankie is at the Beach Ballroom. Jane.
From Aberdeen then, despite the dire warnings that this area would be marginalised by a central belt-based parliament, a yes vote on both counts. Now, some would say that's a yes vote somewhat half-heartedly, a reminder that the turnout was 53.6% compared with 70% in the general election. Anne Begg is Labour MP for Aberdeen South, and Derek Marnoch is the Devo-skeptic chief executive, as I described him earlier, of Aberdeen Chamber of Commerce. Anne, obviously pleased with the result, but surely not ecstatic about the sort of apathy, if we can call it that, in this part of the world.
Well, I think the difference between the yes and no, the margin is very, very high. There can be absolutely no doubt that the people in Aberdeen have voted wholeheartedly for Scottish Parliament.
But very few of them voted. I mean, and this is an area, is it not, certainly the city, which has actually quite a record for high turnouts.
It's not that low. We're talking over 50%. It's a university town where the students aren't here. It's an old register. I'm very heartened by the result tonight.
You weren't disheartened by, shall we say, the lack of interest? I mean, it was quite interesting that even the daily paper here didn't have it at its lead this morning. I mean, does that reflect how people
well, no, I think that reflects perhaps the local paper, but that certainly wasn't reflected on the doorstep, and people were very keen to come out and vote, and we found very few that weren't coming out.
Derek Marnoch, the dire warnings which the Think Twice campaign pedalled heavily up here about being marginalised, views to a certain extent which you echoed. How do you feel?
Well, I think it is a concern of the business community, but we've had a decisive vote, and I think, you know, that is the democratic will of the people, and it's really up to the business community now to say, right, we're going to have a Scottish Parliament, we're going to have tax-paying powers. How do we get involved? How do we make sure that the interests of the North East business community, in fact the Scottish business community, are looked after?
So they're going to have to learn to live with it?
Well, I think we live with political changes day in, day out. I think what we've got to make sure is that we have an opportunity in Scotland now for a new adventure, and let's make sure it's successful.
Do you think that, in fact, it's going to make very little difference, really, in terms of what the businesses stand for up here? Very few of them made a big noise about it at the time.
Well, again, I think business don't like to make a noise about things. Businesses are about buying and selling goods and services, and really don't like to get involved in politics. And I think time alone will tell just how effective it is, and certainly we'll be keeping a very vigilant eye on the situation to make sure that we aren't marginalised.
And do you have any fears that there could be marginalisation at all?
No, the very opposite. I think the electoral system will ensure that we're not marginalised up here, and I think it's going to be a much more consensual Parliament. It will be much different, a new style of politics, and I think that will help areas like Aberdeen no end.
Will you stand for that new style of politics?
I have no idea. That's a decision that obviously I'll have to make at some stage, but at the moment, not a clue.
Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Back to you, Kirsty.
Thanks very much indeed. What the problem is, I understand from the Highlands where they're counting in the Inverness Sports Centre, is that they're counting the spot ballot papers twice, and they're having to sort of verify these spot ballot papers again, so it'll be a few minutes now. Just picking up on the yes-no vote in Orkney and the idea of further devolution to Orkney, do you think there's space in the bill, as Jim Wallace wants, Brian Wilson, for there to be some special provision for Orkney and Shetland Islands?
Well, there already is special provision in terms of representation, but
further devolution seems
well,
to apply for. Explain, Charlie Kennedy, can you just explain exactly what Jim Wallace wants?
Well, I think what the Constitutional Convention scheme recognised, that there should be, I think, if I remember rightly, the phrase they used was greater autonomy as far as Orkney and Shetland are concerned. And as Brian says, the existing parliamentary seats getting split, so they're going to have 2 representatives. I think in addition to that, I suspect that if the Scottish Parliament, for example, was to say, look, we're going to have a special committee that looks at the island issues, or looks at Orkney and Shetland as a distinct unit, or maybe the Western Isles and other islands counted in, that type of thing, I think there wants to be a degree of reassurance that the distinct identity of the island communities is taken into account. I don't myself see how practically you could have further devolution, certainly in a financial sense. I don't think that's on. But I would have thought that if there is a sensitivity as the bill goes through, that will probably meet some of the anxieties that have been expressed.
There was a rather good thing 20 years ago called the Montgomery Committee, which made a lot of recommendations about how there could be a reorganisation.
Proposals, I certainly argued are very similar to what Montgomery argued.
Picking up what we were talking about earlier about the shortfall and the need perhaps for local taxation to help with spending. Charles Kennedy, the Liberal Democrats were the only party at the last the last election to talk about a hypothecated tax, particularly a penny for education. Can you see that a penny, even a penny on the tax variance, which would yield something like, what is it, 140, 150 million pounds, would be something that you would be aiming for in the early stages of a parliament, given the constraints that John Swinney was talking about on possible spending of a parliament?
It's difficult to say. I mean, it's by no means clear that, I mean, you know, it's something of an automatic assumption, and we have said it ourselves up until now, that when we fight the Scottish Parliament elections, it will still be a penny on income tax allocated to education. I don't think that automatically follows, because you're looking at an election almost in 2 years hence. I think one of the interesting things when it comes to this whole tax and spend issue is it does seem to be the case that once it's up and running, the Scottish Parliament will be looking at the voting system for local government, and who knows, it may look at local taxation for local government as well.
Well, now we can go over to Alan Mackay, who's at the Edinburgh International Conference Centre. Alan.
Thanks, Kirsty. Yes, just to confirm what you said a few minutes ago, they're making final checks in Highland. I've just, in fact, been through to talk to Neil McIntosh, the Chief Counting Officer at the Hub, where he's been preparing the declarations throughout the night behind the stage there in the theatre. He says they have finished counting, so just to reassure all our loyal viewers in the Highlands who are anxiously awaiting their result, the counting is finished, they're making final checks, and the result is expected imminently.
Thank you very much indeed for that clarification, Alan Mackay. And Neil McIntosh about to make his 30-second declaration of the night. Just picking up on that question of local taxation, Brian Wilson, do you see the possibility, as your colleague in Edinburgh, David Begg, has talked about, of different forms of local taxation, maybe a sales tax, maybe a local tourist tax?
No, I don't actually, and I think that you know, Donald Dewar has been absolutely straight about what is in the white paper and the translation of the white paper into the legislation. And I don't think that there are going to be bits added on around the edges that you can have this tax and
well, John Mackay, you might want bits added on around the edges.
Well, it's not whether I want them or not, it's what's on the white paper. And paragraph 726 actually makes it quite clear that the Scottish Parliament will have powers to change the system of local authority taxation.
Well, that's a different question.
Well, I thought that was the question. Therefore, you could change it to a local sales tax, a local income tax, or whatever else you want to do. Quite within, at least within 726, that's how I read it. And John Sewell, for the government and the Lords, didn't deny that, and indeed a couple of the government's backbench serious economists said that these taxation powers were important for a Scottish Parliament in their view.
Well, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, I think we've got to obviously walk before we can run, and I think it will begin to scare people a bit if they were to hear us all here, you know, within minutes of the results being declared, saying, right, we're going to have a sales tax, a local income tax, and all the rest of it. But I think if you look logically, and this is over, I would have thought, 10 to 15, maybe 20 years, at a Scottish Parliament looking at the system of elections for local government, if you move to PR for that, then in due course, I think, running logically alongside that is probably more local income tax capacity for local authorities. Because I see a lot of conflict, actually. I see more conflict between the Scottish Parliament and local government within Scotland than I see between the Scottish Parliament and Westminster.
Is that something that you might pick up on, Brian?
Yes, I mean, we're hearing discussions here among the existing established parties in Scotland. What about chucking in another idea into the pot? We're setting up a new parliament with a new voting system. Would it necessarily be simply the established four parties who will be participants in that? Is it possible that minor parties that we know of at the moment might make their way through on the list system? Is it possible that there might be regional parties who develop, perhaps in the Highlands, for example, to attempt to make use of that regional list system? Is it possible that the Conservatives might find themselves transforming into an entirely different
Take too long to get elected in the Highlands. They wouldn't have the patience.
Parliament's term would be over by the time you got the result.
One of the points that comes out of the whole process is that all of the parties will have to adjust their thinking to looking in great detail at how resources are allocated within Scotland, how those relate to the political priorities, and I think that stimulates a debate about how the focus of our public services, and that can only lead to change.
And another thing that we mustn't lose sight of is that a Scottish Parliament will look completely different. The gender balance will be completely different, Robin Oakley. In a sense, this will lead the way for any other Parliament.
Yes, and if I could just go back also to the finance point, we've talked about the tax varying powers only in terms of an assumption that it would be used to raise taxes. Well, if the Scottish Parliament decided to change the basis of local government finance in certain ways, permitting local income taxes and so on, it could also presumably push expenditures in the direction of local authorities sufficient to give some leeway in order actually to cut taxation.
But cutting taxation would what? The block grant would suddenly be cut rather radically.
Grant would be reduced. Government have said absolutely that would happen. That if the Scottish Parliament
Donald Dewar said that the day the White Paper was launched.
To reduce taxation by 3p in the pound, let's say, at the top level, then the block grant would go down by £450 million.
So what would be the advantage? What would be the advantage?
Don't ask me. But I'm not.
Well, you may be a participant in this Parliament.
No, I think I'll stick to London like you, Kirsty.
Brian, just let's pick up again on how the Parliament would look and the kind of people that are going to come into the Parliament, because the strict scrutiny that the Labour Party is going to adopt presumably will be mirrored in other parties. We might actually see some new people come into politics.
Well, it is. I mean, I must confess that with regard to the consensus discussion that was going on earlier, I tend towards Brian Wilson's view on that I think that so much talk of consensus can be hogwash. It can be just palliatives and warm words. But with regard to the approach to the differing nature of the Parliament, I think the PR system will transform Scottish politics. I think it will transform the party system.
But if it transforms it for the better, where's the argument not to have it at Westminster?
That's for the party politicians at Westminster themselves to discover. It may be the case that they find that it is a reasonable system that works well, and the Labour government, as I recall, is committed to a referendum on PR for the Westminster system. Now, it depends when that is held and whether the Scottish system has been allowed to get in place and bed down. Presumably the PR referendum, Robin, would be before that, because you're talking a year 2000 before a Parliament's up and running.
Well, we were promised the names of the Commission which will settle what form of PR might be considered early this autumn. And I think there's a certain amount of pressure going on, is there not, Charles, from the Liberal Democrats on the government at the moment to get this question sorted out, presumably in advance of your own party conference to help us keep the troops sweet.
Well, I don't quite know if the time scale involved, but I think there'll certainly be, I would anticipate an autumn announcement. I mean, things are moving along in terms of the Cabinet Subcommittee and so on, involving Lib Dems and Labour. And I think also that, David Steele has often argued, and I think he's right, that probably the most important thing for proportional representation is somewhere, leaving aside PR for the Euro seats in Northern Ireland, which we've had already, which are a bit of a special case, is to have a mainland election somewhere conducted under proportional representation. That is the most important thing. Now, whether it's going to be the Scottish Parliament that comes first or whether it's going to be the European elections that come first, we don't quite know yet. But I think the fact that actually in 1999 it's going to be a hell of a year, it's going to be a big bang in electoral terms, because you're going to have local government, Euro elections, and one anticipates, certainly Scottish elections.
Lots of up until 5 o'clock in the morning then?
Yes, I mean, the Highlands will sink into the minch at this point, but and you may well have a referendum as well, of course, on UK proportional representation. So that PR is going to be very much up and running, and I would have thought that it becomes much more difficult to ring-fence the House of Commons from all this blaze of activity round about.
Right.
Just trying again to take something of the big picture, I think it's likely that we're all perhaps too close to it, and seeing the minutiae and waiting for this dreaded Highlands result to take the big picture. But I mean, I think genuinely, that especially given the outcome tonight, we will look back on this period as we look back on pre-1832. As a period leading up to an utter transformation.
I'm not that old,
in the nature of
refresh your memory.
Thank you, Kirsty. I think we will look back on this period as we look back on pre-1832, pre the big change, pre the big bang. This is going to be the second one.
And is there not perhaps one man's name that hasn't really been mentioned tonight that should be mentioned in the context of what we've seen tonight, and that is the late John Smith, because it was his commitment to devolution, to a Scottish Parliament, which Tony Blair picked up and ran with. And Tony Blair isn't perhaps as keen and as romantic a devolutionist as some in his party, but he felt morally obliged to take on the commitment which John Smith had left him.
But in fact, it is rather a nice irony that in fact the second question was decided by the vote from John Smith's area tonight.
Indeed.
I think Robin's point is absolutely right, and an awful lot of people will be thinking of John Smith in the next few days. But I think the thing that Tony Blair then did, which greatly strengthened the credibility of the whole scheme, was to put it within the framework of far-reaching constitutional reform.
Yeah.
Devolution is no longer an isolated policy. It is part of a constitutional package. And it's when all the pieces of that package come together, then we really are going to have the modernisation of British democracy, which will be one of the great legacies of Tony Blair's government.
John Smith talked about unfinished business. I mean, I know there is a bill to go through Westminster, but in a sense, do you think that a line has been drawn now in Scotland?
Yes, I think a line has been drawn. I think that it has been a very definite expression of the consensus will. And as far as you can get a consensus will in Scotland, this is what people want. It might change in John Mackay's direction, it might change in John Swinney's direction, but for a long time now, and for a considerable time into the future, I think what the vote tonight reflects the duality of the Scottish position, which is that we want more control of our own affairs within Scotland, but we do not want to lose the benefits of being within the United Kingdom. And we are all perfectly capable of carrying that dual identity. And I make the point again that nowhere in Europe, which has had that duality of identity since the war, has gone on to form a separate state. Well, and I think it's a diversion to think
I'm afraid we're going to have to pause there for a moment, because in a moment or two, we're going to hear from a reporter at Highland to tell us what on earth is going on up there. But so just be aware that we'll go over to that in a moment. Yes, he's there now. Ian MacDonald in Highland. Inverness Sports Centre, could you just describe the scene in Inverness Sports Centre?
Well, the scene is very peculiar indeed, Kirsty, because most of the counters have left. All we have left is the returning officer and a few of his colleagues. We don't quite know what this delay is about. There was a previous delay where there was some debate over dubious papers, and that was discussed at some length. We're looking down on a more or less empty sports centre, I have to say, at this stage, with just a clutch of officials at the middle table, all scribbling furiously, all staring intently, otherwise into computer screens. We should be there, basically, because they've all been counted, and one would have thought they know the result. But for some reason they're not, and we don't know why not. But there's a sort of war council going on out there at the moment. We can only assume the result is imminent, actually, but there's no sign of it.
You're at the sports centre, you're in the sports hall. Is there any danger that somebody's going to have booked a game of badminton for 6 o'clock this morning?
Well, you know that people have been referring to a new dawn for Scotland. Well, this counting centre and the journalists here and the returning officer and his colleagues are probably going to be the people who are actually going to see that new dawn, because we can't be far away now. We're the last in the country, and quite frankly, they're actually stacking up the chairs now and clearing away, but we still haven't got a result.
Ian, I'd just like to bring in a question to you from Charles Kennedy. After all, he has a particular concern here, and he's deeply worried about what's going on in his own area. So here's Charles Kennedy to ask you something.
Good morning, Ian.
Good morning, Charles.
Well, it sounds like a scene from Compton Mackenzie, but the thing I'm interested in is...
The scene from Compton Mackenzie may be about to dissolve. I think we're getting very much closer to the result. Sorry, Charles.
How much was the delay generated earlier on by the decision, do you think, to bring physically all the ballot boxes to Inverness rather than not count them as they would at the general election in the 3 separate parliamentary constituencies?
I'm not sure if it was. I mean, I think there's double the amount of papers to count. I mean, most of the boxes were in reasonably early. I think we're talking about 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. And you know, the process has then gone on for quite a long time, and I think the counting side of it has taken a long time because there's double the usual papers to cover in that count. But I think we're getting very close to the count now. We're looking at signs of activity down there in the hall, but it's still slow activity.
Well, you know, we do imagine that we are going to hear and see the results soon. The rumour from you and indeed from Edinburgh is that the result may be imminent. Now, I know a lot of the counters have left, but presumably the ones that are left in the hall are relaying the result to Ian McIntosh. You must be a very, very tired man now in Edinburgh.
I think, in fact, the returning officer has just relayed that that result to Edinburgh. So we're literally waiting at any moment for him to take the stage. Mind you, we've been waiting for quite a few moments so far, but and make the announcement.
If you just can see through the gap there, you can't see in, but we can see through the gap in the banner to the Edinburgh International Conference Centre. There's certainly a fax arriving. Let's hope it's the fax that will actually determine the result in Highland, because if it isn't, breakfast news is due to go in there in this studio in half an hour's time. So let's hope that we have got Neil McIntosh coming out, wondering what on earth is going on, verifying the facts.
Well, I'm told from the hall here that we're actually waiting, Inverness is waiting for Edinburgh to respond. Now, make of that what you will, but nothing would surprise me at this stage. About half an hour ago, we were saying 5 minutes. People talk about the length of the Highland, 5 minutes. I think we've just proved it here at Inverness, haven't we?
Well, we understand that at this very moment, this is getting rather farcical, but they actually are photocopying the facts in order to verify it back to Inverness. And here he comes, to a loud cheer from the remaining audience. Here is the final result in the referendum on the Scottish Parliament.
The result has been received from Highland. It's now being certified, and we should be with you in about a couple of minutes' time. Thanks very much.
Now, this man is determined to keep us on tenterhooks.
I'm reminded of a recent story. It might be apocryphal, but the Highland Tourist Board, against everyone's expectations, they found that tourism had gone up in the Highlands this year, and the reason was that everyone that went into tourist information centres had counted them going in and then counted them again coming out. So maybe they've done something similar with the...
Maybe that's exactly what's happened here. People are certainly a great deal of consternation in the Highlands.
I think people will be actually
very tired,
aside, pretty fed up with this whole thing. When you see the rest of Scotland out ahead of you to this extent, I would imagine that next week's local press in the Highlands is going to make interesting reading, because I think there will be...
I'll make sure of that.
But in fact, it's interesting because there you have a scene from the Edinburgh International Conference Centre of stalwarts of the Constitutional Convention, the people that have hung in there for all these years, are determined to hang in to the very last vote is in tonight.
I think despite the fact that we're obviously waiting for one result, I think it shouldn't go unnoticed that there has been a very smooth set of arrangements put in place for a very complex vote which has taken place. And there have been one or two hiccups at local level, but over the piece it has been a very well organised event which has allowed the public to choose in a very effective way tonight.
It is a hugely significant moment in Scotland's history, isn't it?
I think it is, and just to revert to perhaps one of the points that we were discussing earlier, I think the biggest transformation in terms of political parties may be upon the Conservatives. They have suffered massive decline over the past 40 years, and it would be my contention, in Scotland, it would be my contention that they've suffered that decline as a consequence of identification as an English party at a time when Scotland was moving more towards a Scottish identity. The other parties, the SNP, it's their very reason for existence, but the other parties, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, managed to sustain and develop a Scottish identity. The Tories simply didn't. Now, if they can, and it is an if, you know, it's not, they have no MPs, they have precious few councillors, and they control no councils. There is no guarantee that the Tories will go up in a Scottish Parliament.
Is profoundly depressed.
Just to cheer up John Mackay at 20 to 6 in the morning, yes. Yes, let's hit him with that one. No, but seriously, I mean, there is no councillor after last night. There is no. They have indeed an extra councillor. There is no guarantee that it would be the Tories who pick up the right-wing free market, free enterprise vote in Scotland. It may be another organisation. It's likely to be the Tories, but they would have to represent themselves in a different fashion in Scotland to garner that vote.
How do you think you might be able to change your appeal?
Obviously, I said quite a long time ago in this programme that I thought that today drew a line under this particular issue, and obviously I'm not going to say I suddenly become a great advocate of having a Scottish Parliament, but I accept the decision, and I made it clear that that is the way that I would certainly be advocating we play it in the Lords, where I have some say, I suppose, and hopefully in the Commons as well, that we will accept the decision, but we will obviously take an active part in committee stages, etc., but we will accept the decision, and we will have to look, as indeed will the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrat Party, at how you actually run a political party in Scotland looking at issues at a Scottish Parliament level within a United Kingdom party looking at issues in the United Kingdom level.
When, of course, a Parliament in Scotland might be a different complexion than a Parliament at Westminster.
Well, it could be a different complexion, and the parties might have to address different issues. And I think it's a problem all the political parties, with the exception of the Nationalists, are actually going to have to address. I don't want to argue with Brian too much, but Labour Party is very tightly controlled from Walworth Road, and obviously that cannot go on if we're going to have a Scottish Parliament. and we are going to have to try and see how we can create a Scottish party within that United Kingdom.
Just picking up a
party.
microcosm of that, who will vet candidates for Scottish Parliament? Will it be Walworth Road or will it be Keir Hardie House?
Oh, I'm sure that will be done within Scotland. But we are one party. We are the Labour Party. We are the Scottish Labour Party. But it is all part of the same movement. And of course there is coordination. But I would certainly expect that exercise will be done very carefully, and it will be done within Scotland, rather incidentally as we did it very effectively at the time Strathclyde region was set up.
Well, at this point, I'm afraid we have to give way to our colleagues who are coming in behind us at 6 o'clock with the Highland Vote. We cannot stay on air any longer for the Highland Vote. Well, tonight, the Scottish people have given an overwhelming vote of confidence to a Scottish Parliament. Donald Dewar called it a modern Parliament for a modern Scotland. And indeed, that Parliament will be sitting, if all goes well, in the Commons and the Lords by the year 2000. So almost 3 centuries after the last Parliament, in May 1707, Scotland will have a Parliament. Now, Justin Webb and Sally Magnuson will be in the studio at 6 o'clock, and that's indeed in 20 minutes' time, to present a special edition of Breakfast News. And for viewers in Scotland, I'll be on the air just after 12:30, that's lunchtime, with Scotland's political leaders for more analysis as tonight's vote really sinks in, as Scotland has decided to have a Parliament in Edinburgh. From all of us here, a very good morning.
Only about 20 minutes before Breakfast News and Business Breakfast at 6 o'clock on BBC One. And until that begins, we'll leave you with pages from CFAX and music.